Let's bring in Hollywood divorce attorney David Glass for more on this. David?
People going through divorces are going through some of the hardest times of their lives, and a lot of what they're going through is emotional. And in any divorce, there's a huge sense of loss, and loss of relationship, of money, some friends.
David Glass here for another new episode of the Hourglass Podcast, where family law and psychology intersect. I'm a certified family law specialist, former psychologist, and the author of Moving On, Redesigning Your Emotional, Financial, and Social Life After Divorce. Our mission is to do all we can to help those going through a breakup or divorce find ways to make the trauma of it all a little bit easier to deal with, more understandable, smoother, and to help people find motivation and inspiration to move on. How? By continuing to share advice and insights from a variety of experts, specialists who are regarded as the best in their respective fields. Narcissism. It's a huge problem. We talk a lot about it on the Hourglass Podcast. Today, we're going to talk to a woman who was married to a narcissist for 7.5 years, Tina Swithen. She's quite a dynamo. Since her divorce, she has set out to make substantial changes in the family court system, all on her own, and has made tremendous headway. Family law attorneys, mediators, and judges all applaud her work. Her book series, Divorcing a Narcissist, and her blog, One Mom's Battle, have become very popular and have been given high praise. Now, Tina, you have a fantastic story. Could you share it with our audience?
Back in 2008, I found myself in a therapist's office trying to make sense of what I viewed as a very difficult marriage. And about an hour into the session, the therapist stopped me, walked across the room, and brought back the DSM-5 and had me read an excerpt out of it on narcissistic personality disorder. And she went on to say, I can't diagnose him, but everything you're sharing with me leads me to believe that at a minimum, this is someone with very high narcissistic traits.
Right.
And the optimist in me went, I'm so grateful to have a label, because if we have a label, I thought in my mind, we can fix this.
Right.
And looking back, the naivety of that, and back then there wasn't a lot of information out there on the topic. And so, that really started me off on my journey to educating myself, and it really was the beginning of the end to my marriage.
Right. And so what behaviors, thinking back now, did you first notice in your ex-husband that gave you cause for concern?
Lack of empathy. It wasn't an authentic empathy. He was really good at, now I can see it as pretending to care deeply about people, but there was something empty there. And over the years, I had started to see a lot of red flags, taking advantage of people, this need to be number one in everything, the biggest house, the best cars, our business, everything was about image. But behind the scenes, he was a completely different person.
And so at what point in your marriage did you get into this therapist and get read the DSM?
The very end, about 7.5 years into it. And for the entire marriage, he would turn things around, and it was always my problem. Right. And I had begged for so long, let's go to marriage therapy. Let's try to figure this out. And at the very end, I finally just gave up and said, I'm going to go by myself.
Right.
And he agreed, yes, you should. You're the problem in this. And so I went in there looking for help for myself to try to figure out what was wrong with me. And, he was open to going to see a different therapist after that.
Right.
But he insisted it was a man with a PhD. He didn't care who, it just had to be a man with a PhD, which in hindsight, that is another red flag in itself.
Right. How did it feel in that very first session? Had you ever been in therapy before, first of all?
I had to deal with childhood traumas and those types of things, but I felt like the wind got knocked out of me, because the second her second response was, there's no fixing this. And
Right.
in that moment, I refused to accept that. I was a fixer. And so I thought, how dare you tell me that I can't fix this? And I was so naive that I went home that night and I told him, she thinks you're a narcissist.
Right.
And we Googled it together. And he said, that sounds like my dad. That doesn't sound like me. But even then I thought, well, we're one step closer to him accepting this because his dad they're the same person
Right.
in a lot of ways. So it gave me hope that he was willing to acknowledge that there was something there.
Right. And so then from that point on, how did you try to handle your husband in terms of being in any sort of relationship with him?
We ended up in therapy together with a male PhD.
Right.
And about 6 months into that process, the psychologist looked at us and said, I don't know if there's anything else I can do to help you. I really think we need to refer him out for a psychological evaluation because I do think that there is something deeper here. That was the end of our marriage. He accused me of manipulating the therapist to make him look bad.
Right.
And so that day when the psychologist said that was truly the end. He called off our marriage. The separation started immediately.
Wow. And so another shocking trip to a therapist's
Yes.
office for you.
Yes. Somebody else who confirmed that, yes, we have a problem.
Right. And then so after that, I understand that you represented yourself in court. And how did that process go? I can't imagine. I'm a divorce lawyer. I see what goes on in the courthouse. I can't imagine representing myself in court, even being a divorce lawyer.
I really didn't have a choice. We lasted about 6 months doing a nesting agreement, just sharing a home because it was my goal to allow my daughters to sleep in the same bed.
Yeah.
I didn't want them bouncing back and forth. And so in my mind, I thought I'm just going to go forward and put up with this and keep peace and stability for these little girls. And that didn't last long. For someone like him, it was about control. And when he started to see me creating a new chapter, getting a new career and starting off, I would, for lack of a better word, I would say it triggered him.
Right.
And so I ended up in the women's shelter in my local area with my 2 little girls. And it was a really dark and humbling few days.
Sure.
I remember, trying to figure out the court forms, knowing that I could not afford an attorney. I had never been to court in my life.
Yeah.
So, trying to understand the forms, but realizing that I didn't have a choice. It was very much radical acceptance. You have to figure this out on your own. And that first day in family court, looking like a deer in headlights. And I remember the judge saying to us, if this is the way you're starting off your divorce, this, implying very high conflict, you're both crazy. And I felt like I had been punched in the stomach, like how I'm in the women's shelter filling out court paperwork, desperate to protect these little girls. And I'm being accused of being part of the problem.
Right.
It was really hard to grasp.
Right. And so were you ever able to get that judge past that initial pronouncement he made?
It took years. I'm very, very resilient. I'm very determined, and nature intended for me to protect these little girls, and I wasn't going to give up. So there were some incredibly dark moments and many times where I felt so defeated by the system that seemed to prioritize his parental rights over my daughter's safety.
Sure.
And I would say, I started off I walked in believing that the system was on the same page, that we were all there to protect, in the best interest of children. And it was a harsh wake-up call to realize that we were not on the same page.
Right.
And so I started studying the system. I would go sit in court. I would go study other cases that I would see and go to the court computer and just dive into those cases, trying to understand things that other attorneys said, case law, and other things, and asked for minors counsel, asked for psych evals, asked for custody evaluations, and we got most of those things, but it still took 6 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
What an incredible journey. I mean, just the persistence, the not giving up-edness to go through 6 years on your own in a foreign system. You eventually managed to get sole custody of your daughters, though.
I did.
How did that come about?
That was a very interesting story. I had tracked my daughters by GPS using a phone, and no one knew that. And I did not know if that were legal, if it was legal.
Right.
But I did it anyway because I was so afraid of, he was taking them. He wasn't telling me where they would be. They were sleeping at many different places. And every time I put them in the car, it was almost like I was memorizing their faces because I didn't know if I would see them again.
Yeah.
And so I started tracking them, and so many things in family court, it's he said, she said. And so I knew I needed to up my game,
Right.
For lack of a better description. And so when there was a moment where he was lying about where the girls had been on a particular weekend, the judge stopped at one point and said, does anyone have proof? Does anyone have GPS to show where they were?
Right.
And I remember raising my hand and saying, can I speak, Your Honor? I actually do. And I had proof of where they had been every hour for a 3-day period of time.
Yeah.
And that was the point where I received sole custody and overnight visits were ended.
Right.
And it very much became, even from that point, chipping away at it. That, even during the daytime visits, I was afraid for their safety.
Yeah.
And there were times where I couldn't afford an attorney, but I had made friends with a PI. And I said, I may be writing you checks until I'm 80 years old,
Right.
but I'm good for it. I just need to know they're safe. And so there were times I hired a PI to follow them just to make sure that they were okay during the visits. And eventually, the court started to see what I was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized it was very much about painting a picture for the court.
Sure.
But it takes time, a lot of time. And eventually we were able to move to supervised visits, and then professionally supervised visits. And then all visits were finally called off.
Right. And so at some point, you turned your focus not away from your family, but to doing public work.
Right.
and explaining to people in family court and the family court personnel and judges themselves what they needed to know to better serve families. When did that switch happen?
I had started writing my blog, One Mom's Battle, about 2 years into my case. And at that point, my purpose was just so my friends and family could follow along, because I was exhausted and I didn't have the energy to try to explain to people, and nothing seemed logical. So
Right.
you quickly realize most people can't make sense of what's happening. So this blog started, and little did I know, in addition to my friends and family following, Christie Brinkley was following from the East Coast, because she was also going through a similar divorce. And so she started promoting my blog, and all of a sudden I went from, probably about 40 views a month on my blog to 40,000 overnight. Wow. And so that really put me in the spotlight. And over the years, it switched from me telling my story to me advocating for others, and really getting in the trenches with them and helping them to understand the system, because there is no rule book that
Right.
comes with this journey. And I really became the person I wish I had in the very beginning. And then now it's moved into advocacy work, supporting important legislation that I believe in, and using the platform that I've created to get the word out about research that's, come out that is, pro-child versus pro-parent.
Right.
And other legislative efforts.
Yeah, and I know personally about that fight. In cases, there's no two cases alike, but more like yours, I'll often submit to the court what's called a Brandeis brief. It's a brief that lays out the psychological literature, which I can do. I used to be a psychologist, now I'm a divorce lawyer, so I can do both sides of it. But it's not always met in a receptive fashion by the judge, that I'm trying to explain to them common ideas in psychology that they aren't acquainted with. Right. So I can't imagine how hard that fight has continued to be for you.
Yes, yeah.
What are 3 or 4 of the most important tips that you want to leave our audience with, those who are currently subjected to the tactics of narcissists? What are the 3 or 4 things they need to remember or they need to do?
I would say you have to remember it's a marathon, and most of these individuals train for a 5K. It's about pacing yourself. There are very few smoking guns in family court.
Right.
And remembering that the threshold for what's acceptable to us as healthy parents is very different for those in the family court system. And I think part of that is because they see the worst of the worst on a daily basis. And it becomes really difficult. Their scale becomes so skewed that we have to keep that in mind, that it may seem really important to us, but it may not even register as important or dangerous for them when we're talking about child safety. Yeah. And then segueing into the next one, which would be learn your local court system, learn what matters to your judge, because these people are human. There are some good ones and there are some not so good ones out there. But for me, it was really learning about all of the different players, I would say, in the system. Minors counsel, what matters to them, what their reputation is like online, custody evaluators, learning which ones to completely stay away from and which ones are truly child-focused.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if people want to find out more about your story or about the amazing advocacy work you're doing, how do they get to you? OneMomsBattle.com has everything you could need to find me, my books, and resources. Great. And what kind of work do you do with people if they're having trouble getting through their divorce case, or they're dealing with a narcissist, or they've got issues with the safety of their kids? Now, you're not an attorney, but what kind of work can you do with them? I fill a role that has previously been untapped, and that is as a high conflict divorce coach. A lot of people get caught up on the term high conflict. I try to educate that it only takes one person to create a high conflict divorce. But as a divorce coach, I act as, a very unique role. I help them understand the system. I help them look at things through different lenses, through the lens of strategy. I defer to their attorney if things come up that they may want to implement into their case. But I serve as a team player and fill a role that their therapist may not be able to, as more of an emotional support and a strategy partner. That's great. Thanks, Tina, for being with us today. What a compelling story you have that you can tell in a very impassioned way. And I'm sure there are those who are watching who have gained a great deal today by hearing about it. Thank you. Thank you. As you know, we like to close out our episodes with a song that makes us more conscious of time and the subject matter we've discussed during this show. Today I've chosen Fight Song by Rachel Platten. The intent and lyrics in this piece seem to reflect the resolve, like that of Tina's, by taking strong and assertive action against her narcissistic ex-husband. I like to choose songs where there's an indication that time has passed in some way. In Platten's anthem, it seems to suggest that she was trapped in a dysfunctional relationship for some time, at least 2 years. But she rises up by stating, "This is my fight song, take back my life song, prove I'm all right song." You can prove it too. Don't waste any more time in a bad relationship. You have the power to be strong.